stacks to the library. I don't think I'm actually supposed to film back here, which is why I don't think I did during my first year. But I'm going to do a practice presentation right now. So this just was a convenient space to do that. It's in the kind of little Carrel, it's called, C-A-R-R-E-L, and it's just kind of like a little office space back here. So yeah, so I'm going to do my practice presentation for you guys. I'll be just doing the really basic, and probably there's like a much easier way to do it, but I'm just going to film the computer screen as I go through my PowerPoint, and I'll be talking through that. So yeah, so this is just an intro to the practice presentation for one of my classes. This is the final paper for the Ammianus Marcellinus class. All right, so we have sailors and ships and Ammianus Marcellinus and the history that he wrote. All right, so to do this study, I studied particular words that can be associated or mean either sailors or members of a crew of a ship, as well as different ships themselves. So to start off with the sailors, we have all the different words that I studied in particular there. And that's the rector, which is kind of another word for like a helmsman in this case. Often it just means a governor. Then we have piraticus, which is the adjective form for the pirates. Nauticus, which is the sailors, actually meaning sailors. Navicularius is the ship master, similar to the magister of sailing, and again, this can be used in different contexts as well. And then navigantes, that's people who are sailing. Navalis is the adjective just meaning of ships or of boats, and that gets used once as describing people. All right, so getting into the ways that I've categorized these different uses. So Ammianus uses sailors as part of the narrative. So sometimes this is the primary narrative, as in the sailors are directly relevant to the story he's talking about in the moment or the episode he's describing. Sometimes they're more relevant as part of the background or historical narrative. For example, if Ammianus is saying, back in the day, there were sailors who did such and such thing in the place that I'm talking about now, and then goes on to talk about things happening in that story. Geographical markers or measures. So this one I'll explain more a little bit later what this category means. It's a little weird in terms of the sailors. I don't know that I'll have an excellent example in this presentation, but I'll explain it more later. Also metaphors and similes. So, just saying something is like a sailor, or someone doing something is in the same as if a sailor had done such and such other thing. So those are the categories. When we look at the different totals for each category, so these instances of these or occurrences of these words can fulfill multiple of these. For example, if Ammianus is giving a metaphor that pertains to times gone by, that would, or in the background information, right, that would be something that has both the historical narrative and the metaphor categories. So you can see the most often sailors come up in the primary, but not by much. It's quite close, and often in metaphoric sense. So yeah. So then getting on to this, so why do sailors come up so few times, especially even just half the time about in metaphors, not even necessarily directly talking about members within this story? So it seems to indicate that the sailors, at least from Ammianus' perspective, they're a peripheral group. They're not important to his kind of perspective. And for example, in the primary narrative, they're only mentioned 3 times as either helping Julian avoid unwanted litigation. Okay, I see what I did here. So this is the practice, like I said. So in the primary narrative, they're only mentioned 3 times as sailors, part of the story, and not as metaphors. So that includes one instance as they're helping Julian avoid unwanted litigation. Another instance is just sailors getting murdered. And then lastly, you also just have an instance where he's describing kind of a battle scene, and then he's like, well, the sailing contingent of the attack failed, so the rest of them had to keep going. So overall, when he actually mentions sailors, not in a metaphoric sense and not in a historical sense, it's not really usually a good thing. It's just kind of, or at the very least, kind of just a more random thing, and not contributing to some of his larger like military narratives or anything like that. So this seems to be possibly fitting a stereotype of the time where sailors were kind of considered, and people of that kind of type were not usually looked on as fondly, or at least in just general Roman history, right? Sailing wasn't considered kind of the highest profession, as much as like fighting or farming or other things. So we see some kind of traditional Roman attitudes perhaps coming through here. All right, so then going on to the ships. So the categories, again, are pretty similar. The only addition here is the addition of tools as a category. And so these tools, I just mean instrumentalizing ships, essentially, is what I mean by that. And so usually that's going to be for transport, oftentimes of people, but sometimes of just normal shipping of goods and things like that as well. So these are all the words that I studied for this particular thing. So the middle column is all just boats, different types of boats. So these aren't going to be as large as ships generally, but and that's why I put them all in italics. On the last column are technically some that are adjectives. So like I said already with navalis, that's just more of anything having to do with boats or ships. Lusorius is in particular kind of the adjective for a particular kind of ship, a scouting ship. Honorarius is also a particular kind of ship, a cargo ship. So that's why I've put those in bold. So the overall data, again, it shows that most often what's happening when ships are mentioned is they're being instrumentalized, as one would expect, as either some kind of transportation or a tool for movement as well. We'll see a couple examples of that in a moment, but usually it's coming up in the primary narrative. Sometimes it's also in a flashback there. So getting into some examples. So ships as tools. So often ships can be considered or used in this instance as bridges. So rather than ferrying people back and forth across a river, it seems like it was quite common practice, at least for these instances that are mostly having to do with soldiers and the army, that they would roll or align the ships and walk across the boats in such a way to make a bridge. Also, we have kind of a more mundane example there of ships carrying some legionaries on patrol. So we see here this kind of transport idea, but also instrumentalizing them in terms of an action, right? A patrolling action. Ships as geographical markers. So here we have a large quote that's kind of talking about describing different geographical areas in ways that relate to ships. So either large enough, a river being large enough to carry ships, or a certain area having a voyage of a certain distance is kind of the way to measure that distance, measuring it practically in terms of a voyage. All right. Then on some of these other examples, some with boats. So again, there's an interesting example with the linuculus, because in this case, both of the instances of this word being used are particular for fishing boats. So that could be a particular type of boat beyond just a smaller vessel. In both these cases, though, it's not directly part of the story. It's usually either something that people were trying to find but couldn't find, as in the example I put there, or else it was part of a someone had an incident that was mentioned in there, like as a different part of things, where it's just mentioned that they were in a fishing boat earlier. Then we have another example with the limbus, and this example is just a great piece that fits in with some of Ammianus's other ideas of stopping or making fun of the kind of Roman higher class. And the way he's doing that in this case is by comparing their boat trips out on the lake, you know, kind of nice fun times, and they go out there and think that they're doing some heroic adventure, which is of course kind of preposterous, at least in Ammianus's view. So this is also a joke aimed at his audience, right? They would get this because many of these Roman high officials are the ones who are hearing this text. All right, so then we also have Julian's epic fleet, so that's the Latin for that. And then here is the last part of this fleet. So this was the Emperor Julian on his big expedition, his big invasion of Persia. He links up with a large fleet, compares it to the fleet of Xerxes, mentions having 1,000 cargo carriers, 50 warships, and an equal number of ships for making bridges. So again, we see kind of the different varieties of ships going on there and how they're all being combined in this one fleet, which makes it so impressive. All right, so general patterns of use. We have boats and ships as bridges. Boats and ships for hunting down fleeing enemies, especially after a battle, if they're trying to escape across a river or something like that. They are often hunted down, or they get across the river and then the Roman soldiers will take a boat to chase them. We've already seen kind of boats for ships and supplies. That includes cargo and grain. Boats and ships for attacks, right? So a lot of this context is the invasion of Persia, like I said, but also other battles where different ships are participating in sieges, being kind of launch points for starting an attack, disembarking and then beginning their attack, or just part of maneuvers. One force might be attacking by land, another force by sea. And we saw this a little bit with the scout ships idea and also the patrolling example, but usually it's just kind of generic ships being mentioned, no special demarcation of what kind of ship. And also we've also seen, most interesting, as ships and navigation as tools for description, which is again kind of measurements, things of that nature. So that's kind of the result that stood out to me the most, that I wasn't expecting seeing, this other kind of use of ships. And of course, also I mentioned there's the metaphors. All right, so here's some bibliography, and that is all for my presentation.